From 32,000 British soldiers landing on the shores of New York in the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen, to a single Japanese submarine surfacing off the coast of Oregon during World War II and calmly lobbing shells at a golf course full of nobody, this is how every invasion of the United States actually played out. Some of these invasions almost ended the country before it had finished being born. Others are so strange, so small, and so completely erased from the story America tells about itself that most Americans have no idea their own soil was ever occupied by a foreign army at all, some more than once, in places most people couldn't point to on a map. This isn't the war America won. This is the war America almost lost, more than once, in ways nobody put in the textbook. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a map of the United States the same way again. Most people think the American Revolution was a scrappy, plucky underdog story from the very first shot. A few brave militiamen, a handful of battles, independence declared, done. But actually, just weeks after the Declaration of Independence was signed and the ink was barely dry, Britain answered with the single largest invasion force assembled anywhere on Earth up to that point in human history. Over 400 ships, 32,000 professional soldiers, battle-hardened Hessian mercenaries paid to kill, the full weight of the Royal Navy, all of it converging in the span of a single summer on one small, undefended, unsuspecting island, Staten Island, New York. George Washington had roughly 19,000 men to answer with, and most of them had never fired a musket at another human being in their lives. Farmers, shopkeepers, apprentices, handed rifles and told to hold a line against the most powerful army on the planet. The British weren't interested in winning a battle here. They wanted to end the entire rebellion in a single overwhelming stroke, with more firepower thrown at the colonies than had ever been deployed anywhere in the Western Hemisphere before. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Long Island, where British forces slipped around Washington's flank at night and nearly trapped his entire army against the water. With his back literally against the East River, and the British poised to end the war in one afternoon, Washington did something almost nobody remembers today. Under cover of a freak fog that rolled in overnight, the kind of fog soldiers on both sides described as almost unnatural, he silently ferried his entire army across the river by rowboat, one small group at a time, right past British lines, without losing a single soldier in the crossing. New York fell anyway, just days later. The British would occupy the city for the next 7 years, the longest continuous foreign military occupation of American soil in the country's entire history. Loyalist refugees packed the streets. American prisoners of war were crammed onto rotting British ships anchored in the harbor, where more men would eventually die of disease and starvation than were killed in every battle of the Revolution combined. The irony is brutal. The city that would one day become the symbolic gateway of American freedom spent almost the entire Revolutionary War as occupied enemy territory. Just 8 years after that occupation finally ended, and the ashes of a hard-won peace had barely settled, the young country would face something almost nobody expects when they open a history book: a second full-scale foreign invasion, from the very same enemy, aimed at an even bigger prize. Most people assumed the War of 1812 was some minor, forgettable border skirmish, barely worth a footnote between the Revolution and the Civil War. But actually, in August 1814, a British army landed on American soil and did something no foreign power has ever done before or since. They marched straight into the capital of the United States and burned it to the ground. It started with a humiliation America still hasn't fully lived down. Roughly 4,500 British regulars, soldiers hardened by years of fighting Napoleon across Europe, met a much larger American militia force at Bladensburg, Maryland, just outside the capital. The militia broke and scattered so fast, so immediately, abandoning their positions almost the instant the fighting started, that the battle is still nicknamed the Bladensburg Races to this day. The road to Washington stood completely open. By nightfall, British officers were sitting inside the White House dining room, eating a dinner the Madisons had left half-cooked on the table as they fled into the countryside. Then the British set it on fire. They burned the Capitol building. They burned the Treasury. They burned nearly every public building in the city, lighting the Washington night sky orange for miles. First Lady Dolly Madison managed to save exactly one thing before running: the full-length Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, which she ordered cut straight out of its frame in the final minutes before the British arrived. And the irony of what happened next is almost too perfect. The humiliation of watching the Capitol burn is exactly what hardened American resolve at the next target on the British list, Baltimore, where a defiant American flag still flying at dawn over Fort McHenry, the single lowest moment in American military history, accidentally wrote the national anthem. But here's something almost nobody learns in school. Burning Washington wasn't the end of that invasion, and it wasn't even the last piece of America the British were willing to take for themselves. Before that British fleet ever sailed home, they quietly carved off a whole slice of the United States and simply kept it. While cannons were still smoking over Washington, a completely separate British force sailed north along the coast of Maine and simply took it, not raided it, not passed through it, occupied it, governed it, and quietly renamed it. British troops captured the town of Eastport without firing a single shot, then pushed further south and claimed roughly 100 miles of the Maine coastline, including the town of Castine. They didn't plant a flag and leave. They set up a full, functioning civil government. They forced local residents to publicly swear loyalty oaths to the British Crown or be treated as enemies. They collected customs duties on every ship that passed through the harbor. And they started calling the entire territory New Ireland, as if it were simply the newest addition to the British Empire. For 8 straight months, a piece of the United States was, quite literally, a British colony again. Local families paid British taxes out of their own pockets. British magistrates ran the local courts. Children in Castine grew up, for the better part of a year, under a flag that wasn't theirs. And when the war officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent, most of that occupied Maine coastline was handed back to the United States without much fanfare, except for Eastport, which the British simply refused to leave for another 4 full years, arguing over exactly where the new international border was supposed to fall. The strangest detail of all, the customs revenue the British collected while occupying that stretch of Maine was reportedly substantial enough to help fund the construction of a university back in Canada. A piece of the United States helped bankroll a foreign institution while it sat under foreign occupation, and almost nobody outside a handful of Maine historians has ever heard this actually happened. If you're enjoying discovering the parts of American history nobody ever put in your textbook, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the rest, because the next invasion of America wasn't even carried out by a foreign country. Because not every invasion of American soil came from across an ocean. Sometimes it came from just across a thin, quiet, almost entirely undefended line. And this time, the invaders weren't even a foreign army at all. Most people think the Confederacy's northernmost military action of the entire Civil War happened somewhere around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. But actually, the true northernmost land action of the war happened almost 400 miles further north, inside the state of Vermont, launched from an entirely different country. In October 1864, 21 Confederate agents who had spent months quietly living undercover in Montreal, posing as ordinary Canadian civilians, crossed the border into the small town of St. Albans, Vermont. In a matter of minutes, they simultaneously robbed all 3 banks in town at gunpoint, made off with roughly $200,000 in cash, tried to burn the entire town down using bottles of experimental Greek fire, and shot an unarmed civilian bystander in the street, all while loudly declaring, in front of terrified townspeople, that they were soldiers of the Confederate States of America carrying out a legitimate act of war on Union soil. Then they simply rode back across the border into Canada and vanished into the crowd. When American authorities demanded their extradition to stand trial, a Canadian court ruled that the raiders had been acting as legitimate military combatants under official orders, and released every single one of them, keeping only the recovered stolen cash. The irony almost writes itself. A real invasion of United States soil, carried out by Americans, launched from a foreign country's territory, ended up triggering an honest-to-God diplomatic near-crisis between Washington and the British Empire, who still controlled Canada at the time. The Confederacy's last, strangest weapon in the entire war wasn't a cannon or a rifle, it was a coordinated bank heist that used an international border as its getaway car. And while Confederate raiders were pulling off bank robberies from across the northern border, the Confederacy's own government was quietly planning something far more audacious back home, an actual army marching straight toward the gates of the Capitol itself. Most people assume Washington, D.C. was never seriously threatened again after the British burned it in 1814. But actually, exactly 50 years later, a Confederate army marched to within sight of the Capitol dome itself, and this time, the President of the United States was standing on the front line, watching it happen with his own eyes. In July 1864, Confederate General Jubal Early led roughly 14,000 men on a lightning campaign up through Maryland, aiming directly at the poorly defended Capitol. Washington's garrison had been stripped nearly bare, its best troops pulled away to reinforce Ulysses S. Grant's grinding siege of Petersburg. For one brief, genuinely terrifying window, the capital of the United States was defended by little more than convalescing hospital patients still recovering from wounds, government office clerks handed rifles for the first time, and barely trained emergency militia. The decisive moment happened at Fort Stevens, on the northern edge of the city, where Abraham Lincoln himself, against the frantic pleading of his officers, climbed up onto the fort's exposed parapet to watch the fighting unfold. It made him the only sitting president in all of American history to come under direct, aimed enemy fire. A young officer standing nearby, reportedly shouting at the president to get down before he was shot, was a future Supreme Court justice named Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. A story so good that generations of historians have argued over whether the exact quote is real, even while agreeing the moment itself absolutely happened. Union reinforcements from the VI Corps arrived just hours before Early's planned assault would have begun. Early called the attack off, and the moment quietly passed into history as one of the single closest calls the American capital ever faced. The Confederacy came within a single day's delay of possibly capturing Washington, D.C. for the second time in 50 years, and almost nobody remembers how close it actually was. And the reason Early ultimately turned back when he did? Spoiler alert, it wasn't overwhelming Union firepower. It was hesitation, at the exact moment speed would have mattered most. For the next 50 years, the mainland United States wouldn't see another foreign flag cross its border. Then, in the middle of somebody else's civil war entirely, that long silence finally broke, in a way that quietly changed American military technology forever. Most people assume no foreign force has invaded the continental United States since the War of 1812 ended. But actually, in March of 1916, several hundred armed men under Mexican Revolutionary General Francisco Pancho Villa crossed the border in the dead of night and attacked an American town directly. Villa's motives were tangled up in the chaos of the ongoing Mexican Revolution, a sense of betrayal by a former ally, fury over American arms shipments to his rivals, and a desperate need for supplies. Around 4:30 in the morning, roughly 480 of Villa's men stormed into Columbus, New Mexico, burning buildings, looting stores at gunpoint, and killing 18 Americans, several of them still asleep in their beds, before a scrappy, undermanned garrison of U.S. cavalry managed to rally, counterattack, and drive the raiders back across the border in a running fight that spilled miles into Mexican territory. And the reason it escalated the way it did? It triggered the largest American military mobilization since the Civil War itself. President Wilson dispatched General John J. Pershing on what became known as the Punitive Expedition, sending over 10,000 American troops deep into Mexico for nearly a year, hunting for Villa using early motorized trucks and, for the first time in American military history, combat aircraft in active field operations. A young cavalry officer riding along on that expedition, quietly absorbing lessons about mechanized warfare he would carry for the rest of his career, was a lieutenant named George S. Patton. They never caught Villa. The expedition eventually withdrew, embarrassed, empty-handed. The invasion almost nobody remembers today ended in outright failure for both sides, but it quietly forged the machine and the officers that would go on to fight the next century of American wars. For the next 25 years, no enemy soldier set foot on American soil again, and an entire generation grew up believing two oceans made the country untouchable. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, that illusion ended all at once, and the whole world changed with it. Most people think of Pearl Harbor as a single, sudden surprise strike, planes appearing out of a clear sky on an otherwise ordinary Sunday morning. But actually, it was the opening move of a single coordinated Japanese assault stretched across the entire Pacific in the very same 24 hours, timed with almost mathematical precision. Starting at 7:48 in the morning on December 7, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft, launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned undetected north of the islands, struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet in 2 devastating waves. 4 battleships sunk outright. Over 2,300 Americans killed in under 2 hours. It remains to this day the deadliest single attack ever carried out on American soil until September 11th, 6 decades later. But the strangest coda to that entire morning played out on a tiny, almost forgotten Hawaiian island called Niihau, where a wounded Japanese pilot named Shigenori Nishikaichi crash-landed his damaged fighter just hours after the attack. Isolated native Hawaiian residents, completely unaware that war had even started, initially treated him almost as a stranded guest, until word of Pearl Harbor finally reached the island days later, and the pilot, aided by 2 local residents of Japanese descent, attempted to seize control of the island by force. A native Hawaiian man named Ben Kanahele was shot 3 times at close range trying to stop him, and, badly wounded, still managed to kill the pilot with his bare hands. A single downed airman had tried in miniature to conquer a piece of American soil almost entirely by himself, and lost in the end to one furious, bleeding man who simply refused to let him win. The massive coordinated attack shocked an entire nation into war within hours. The tiny personal one on Niihau quietly became one of the strangest true stories to come out of the entire conflict. Pearl Harbor is the invasion everyone remembers, taught in every classroom in the country. What almost nobody remembers is that 6 months later, Japan didn't just strike American territory from the air, they actually landed, captured, and occupied it. Most people sincerely believe no enemy army has physically occupied United States territory since the British left after the War of 1812. But actually, in June 1942, Japanese forces invaded and captured 2 islands in the Aleutian chain of the Alaska Territory, Attu and Kiska, and held them for well over a year. Roughly 2,300 Japanese troops landed on Attu, took its small population of American residents prisoner, and raised the Japanese flag over incorporated United States territory for the first time in the 20th century. For 14 straight months, in the freezing fog of the North Pacific, part of America was, once again, occupied ground, and almost nobody back home even knew it was happening thanks to wartime censorship. The decisive moment came in May 1943, when American forces finally landed to retake Attu. What followed was one of the most brutal, least remembered battles of the entire Pacific War, fought in near-constant fog and knee-deep frozen tundra, temperatures plunging well below freezing, culminating in a desperate, screaming Japanese banzai charge that overran a U.S. field hospital before being wiped out almost to the last man. Of the roughly 2,300 Japanese defenders on the island, only 28 survived to be taken prisoner. Proportionally measured man for man, it remains one of the single costliest battles the United States ever fought in the entire war. Then came the final, almost unbelievable twist. When American forces landed on neighboring Kiska weeks later, braced for an even bloodier fight than Attu, they found the island completely empty. Under cover of thick fog, the entire Japanese garrison had secretly evacuated by sea days earlier without a single American ship noticing, leaving the U.S. military to storm an island where the enemy had already vanished, and to still suffer well over 200 casualties from friendly fire, land mines, and booby traps left behind on an island with no one left to fight. The Aleutians remain the only American soil ever formally occupied by a foreign army in the entire 20th century. But they weren't the only place the war physically reached the mainland, and what happened next is almost too strange to believe actually occurred. Most people assume the continental United States, the actual lower 48 states, was never directly attacked at all during World War II. But actually, enemy fire struck American soil on at least 3 separate occasions, using 3 of the strangest, most improbable weapons of the entire war. It started in February 1942, when a Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, under cover of darkness, and fired 17 shells at a coastal oil field, the first shelling of the American mainland by a foreign power since the War of 1812. 4 months later, another Japanese submarine surfaced off the coast of Oregon and directly shelled Fort Stevens itself, making it the only active military installation in the continental United States ever attacked by enemy forces during the entire war. Almost comically, the shells caused barely any real damage at all. Reportedly, the fort's own commander ordered his men not to return fire, worried the muzzle flashes from their own guns would only help the Japanese submarine aim better in the dark. Then, starting in late 1944, Japan launched something no country on Earth had ever attempted before: unmanned incendiary balloons, riding the high-altitude jet stream nearly 9,000 miles across the open Pacific Ocean to drift down and explode on American soil, entirely unmanned, entirely automated. Thousands were launched from the Japanese coast. Hundreds are believed to have actually reached North America, landing in states stretching from Alaska all the way to Michigan. In May 1945, one of those balloons drifted quietly down into a forest near Bly, Oregon, where a pastor's wife and 5 children on a Sunday church picnic stumbled onto the wreckage and, out of pure curiosity, pulled at it. It detonated instantly, killing all 6 of them on the spot, the only deaths from direct enemy action anywhere on the American mainland during the entirety of World War II. The most advanced, most heavily industrialized military machine on Earth never once managed to truly invade the continental United States. But a simple paper balloon, riding nothing but the wind, quietly did what no army on the planet ever could. Here's the pattern hiding underneath every single one of these stories, once you line them all up in order. Almost every invasion of the United States succeeded exactly as long as it stayed small, fast, and limited. And every single one that tried to become something bigger, something more ambitious, collapsed under its own weight. The British held New York for 7 years and still lost the entire war. Jubal Early got close enough to the Capitol Dome to see it with his own eyes, and still had to turn back. Japan captured actual American soil in Alaska and still couldn't hold onto it for even a full 14 months. America has been invaded, occupied, shelled, robbed, and bombed by foreign hands far more times than most Americans will ever learn sitting in a classroom, and yet, through all of it, it has never once actually been conquered. A few numbers worth carrying with you. The only sitting president in American history to come under direct, aimed enemy fire was Abraham Lincoln, standing on a parapet at Fort Stevens in 1864. The only foreign military occupation of an American state anywhere in the 20th century lasted 14 months, on 2 remote islands most Americans still couldn't find on a map today. The only deaths caused by enemy action on the continental U.S. mainland in the entirety of World War II weren't caused by a bomb dropped from a plane or a bullet fired from a rifle. They were caused by a paper balloon that had drifted, completely unguided, across an entire ocean. And the largest invasion force ever assembled against American shores didn't arrive in 1941 or even in 1814. It came in 1776, before the country had even finished being born. Maybe that's the real lesson sitting quietly underneath all of this. The United States was never actually protected by distance or by 2 wide oceans or by luck. It was protected again and again by the sheer repeated failure of every single force that ever tried to take more than just a piece of it. The line between invaded and conquered turned out to be the entire story all along, and it's a line this country has walked right up to more times than almost anyone realizes. If stories like this, the ones that got buried, the ones nobody ever put in your textbook, are exactly the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe right now, because this is far from the last hidden chapter of American history still waiting to be dug back up.